Hi guys, this is Dr. Sadasivam once again with you. In the earlier video, we had talked a lot about self-awareness. What is it that we all need to do to increase our self-awareness? And in this particular video, we will be talking about the second aspect, which is managing our own emotions. Now, when we talk about emotions, we can be very clear about the fact that life without passion is not worth living. We all face so many emotional storms throughout our lives in some way or other, and therefore, keeping the emotions in check is key to emotional well being. Now, if you look at the calculus of the heart, the ratio of the positive to negative thoughts, that's the one which decides our emotional stability. Now, the objective is not to avoid unpleasant feelings, but to keep in mind that we should not let any stormy feelings left unchecked. Therefore, managing emotions becomes the key in our day-to-day behavior. Now, the question is the art of putting ourselves or soothing ourselves after an emotional issue is a life skill. As we have discussed many times, this is not a skill which is taught in universities, but a skill that needs to be learned through our life experience, and we need to pick on those skills. In fact, we do not have any control on when we will be swept by emotions. But one thing is very sure, we are surely in control of how much time that negative feeling rests in our mind. That control is with us. Now, without that balance, we are led to extremes. The extremes in terms of chronic anxiety, uncontrollable rage, depression, and host of other negative feelings which build one over the other. But all of us know that such moods, they pass with time and patience. Many a times, guys, agitations of chronic nature in the emotional brain, they are too strong to be overcome without the external medication. That happens, guys, when we fail to keep those emotions in check during the initial stages. We need to recognize the fact that all emotions are very, very natural and they need to be experienced as they present themselves through various life circumstances, various life situations, day in and day out. Therefore, that control becomes extremely important. Now, if you take the simple example of a road rage, road rages are generally spontaneous and they have a trajectory of their own. For example, if somebody drives close to your car or somebody bangs your car, the initial reaction will be to pick up a fight with them. But over a period of time, you will observe that a thought which comes up later during this build-up of anger, that thought triggers far greater intensity of anger than the one that came in the beginning. That's typically we are talking about, and that plays in most of those road rages. For example, if a guy comes too close to your car, nothing has happened, of course, the guy has gone past you. But we have seen certain scenes on the road where this guy goes behind him, shows off his hands, aggressive body language he displays to the other driver sitting in his own seat. Because every time this kind of retaliation happens between both of them, there is a thought that comes to one's mind. What if this guy had banged me? What if this guy had done this? So each of these thoughts trigger a much greater intensity of anger than the first one that caused it. And we have seen that happening most of the time. Now contrast this with a sense of, some kind of a conciliatory mood. Contrast this behavior, because the person who is going past you is a total stranger. We see thousands of such people when we travel on the road. We are all passengers in this road momentarily. Momentarily we meet up and he goes his way and we go our way. Now probably when that happens, you change your frame of reference, change your frame of thinking. Probably that guy had a bad day, probably he had an issue, probably this guy did not see our car on the left, quite possible. Probably his mirror was not adjusted, maybe the cleaner while cleaning his car readjusted the mirrors and he couldn't get it adjusted, anything, any problem, anything of that sort. But if you bring these kind of thoughts in your mind, number one, you're not getting angry, and that guy goes his way, you go your way, right? Therefore, tempering this anger is very, very important. But getting angry is very, very natural in that kind of a situation. This is what many researches have been conducted by one Don Zillman. He's a professor from the University of Alabama. He says that the universal trigger for anger under any circumstances, that is a sense of being endangered. Like in our earlier videos, we had talked a lot about fight or flight syndrome. Either we fight that situation or we run away from that situation, depending on what that situation is. And most of the times, anger builds on anger. Now, if you look at some of these researches of Zillman, he sees escalating anger as a sense of provocation, a series of provocations. When you see that as a series of provocations, now when you talk about a series of provocation, they obviously come one after the other, each one triggering that anger provoking thought. And typically what happens in the series is that the second one comes into existence even before the first one had subsided completely, and the third one on top of those. Now typically what is happening is each wave is riding on the tail of the previous one. Now in this kind of a situation, what could be the balm for anger? Balm, I mean panacea. There are two ways, guys. One way is to seize on the situation and then challenge. Challenge what? Challenge the thoughts, not the man. Challenge the thoughts. Those thoughts that triggered the first wave of anger and the subsequent ones that fanned the flames of anger. Remember? We talked a lot about it in our earlier videos a little while before. Now, once again, in that kind of a situation, you rethink about the amygdala driven surges. We had talked a lot about these surges before in the earlier videos. Typically, the reptilian brain, which metamorphosed into a mammalian brain, which is the animal brain. Many a times we embrace that thought. Now you think we talked about hovering attention to our own thoughts. Now rethink about the amygdala driven surges that we discussed in the earlier videos. And at this point of time, people who are unforgiving and people who are beyond being reasonable, their thoughts always revolve around revenge and reprisal. They're totally oblivious to what the consequences could be, because this excitation, this excitement in their mind fosters them with a false sense of power and invulnerability that inspires aggression. This is one most important reason for road rages. A verbal duel, and then a verbal duel changing into a fist fight later. And sometimes It results in murders, guys. Go through newspapers. Every day something of that sort is happening, especially in New Delhi, on petrol pumps, on the road. And this is exactly what we are talking about. So, most of us, in spite of our rich experiences, good educational background, we lack cognitive guidance and we tend to fall back on the most primitive of the responses. Typically, when I say response, we mean response when we were cavemen, right? So education, our own experiences, our own self-perception of wisdom that we have, they don't work. Therefore, there are certain things very, very effective. They are called as balm for anger. I'm using this word because Dr. Daniel Goleman has used the same word in his book, Emotional Intelligence. So, some of the things that he is suggesting in order to diffuse anger is that firstly, during those moments, we need to track and we need to challenge the thoughts that led to anger. And not just that, we also need to think about the subsequent thoughts that fanned the flames of anger. Remember, we talked a lot about it many times, the afterthoughts. Those afterthoughts are much more powerful in triggering that chain of anger than the initial thought that caused anger in the first place. And therefore, tracking and challenging those thoughts that led to anger is extremely important. Now, it is extremely important. Now, what is even more important is the timing. In fact, the earlier during the cycle of anger, the better. At very small levels of anger, they work, but at higher levels of rage, they do not work because of a psychological concept called as cognitive incapacitation. So in the subsequent videos, when we discuss other topics like motivation, how to control anger, etc., I will be bringing out this point. Now, in the year 1899, a scientific study was conducted. It was done by a professor, Dr. Demystified. It was a path-breaking scientific study which was done in 1900, approximately 120 years back. And he had suggested an extremely effective model for de-escalation of anger. He talks about it as a cooling period because many a times when we are very angry, he's just that we need to have a cooling period. And he suggests a lot of things. He says that distraction is one of the most powerful mood altering devices. So whenever people are angry, he suggests a lot of things like going for a long drive, going for a long walk, and many a times he also suggests muscle relaxation and physical exercises because in his research, he has hypothesized that it's very, very hard to be angry when you are in a pleasant mood. So bringing that pleasantness in your mood is important. We do that all the time, but these kinds of reinforcements actually help us to deal with anger in a much better and effective manner. But let us also remember one thing. Many a times what happens is when people go for a long walk or a drive, they pursue the same thoughts that triggered anger in the first place. Because when you're lonely, when you're walking, you're driving, if you're bent on those thoughts, this method is not going to work at all, guys. As per the NTC, but we all fall, fall prey to that. So this consciousness of where we can go wrong is also important because that will help us wherever these anger-inducing thoughts come to your mind. It's easy to come out of that because recognition is the first step towards regulation, refinement. That is why we are focusing on this particular point, recognition of anger again and again. Another professor by name Dr. Redford Williams, he was a professor in the Duke University, and he suggests lots and lots of effective ways to control anger. And of course, distraction is one thing that TC had suggested. In fact, Dr. Redford suggests That distraction, of course, is important. You need to move away from the place of anger. And what he also suggests is, please write down your thoughts. It is easy for us to think, but it's extremely important that we write down those thoughts in a piece of paper, because that helps challenging those thoughts in a much effective manner, and it becomes a lot more easier also, right? Okay guys, I hope you like this video, and as we go on, we will look at series of other videos. Thank you very much.